Okay, so let's start by talking about your desire to write for the first time. Let's go back to the beginning and the desire to write. And when did you realize that you could actually get paid to actually do this? Not only a dream, but actually a real job, whichever you want.
So I've always loved storytelling,
Right.
and I have always wanted to be a writer. I just like sharing stories. I liked just making up things as I go along, and I love fantasy. I love just all of those kinds of elements. And when I was a kid, my dad almost got tired of me reading stories so fast that he would joke to me, like, if you're going to read books this fast, you're just going to have to write them yourself. And so I started doing that. I started writing things down, and I never really thought about writing for money.
Right.
And it wasn't until really I was in my 20s that I was writing stories, and my husband would say, you're constantly writing, you're writing these stories. Have you ever thought about seeing what it would take to get published? That I really started looking into it, and here I am now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And in your case, Adrienne?
So when I was very young in elementary school, I got in trouble a lot in school. And my teacher would send me out of the classroom to the library. And so I made friends with my librarian at my school. And I think she was like, she wasn't my teacher, so she was like, could kind of be my buddy. And that's kind of how I first got into books and got introduced to reading like consistently. But I first really started dreaming about becoming an author in that library because I would look at all the book covers. I love to like pick them up and like look, the front, the back, inside the jacket, and all of those things. And I would imagine seeing my own name on the front of the book. So I definitely always had a very dreamy outlook about being a writer, and was like, if I could do anything in the world, that's what I would do for my work. But I did not think it was I did not think I could get paid for it, really.
Oh, okay.
So I was like, I'm not going to make that a job or try to become an author because it probably won't happen. I'll probably fail, and I probably won't be able to make a living.
Right.
But in my 20s, I, like Brigid, I changed my mind and decided that I didn't want to regret not trying.
So I started writing as a hobby.
Right.
I wrote for 10 years. I wrote fanfic just as a hobby for pleasure. It was just pure fun. And I was working on my graduate degree in computer science at the time. And I wanted to work on computer games. And then I discovered that the computer game industry is not, shall we say, the most conducive to a family life where you're allowed to have time for anything else whatsoever. And also, my first experience was I had to go and do a beta test because there weren't many companies doing computer games in New York at the time.
Right.
I had to go do a beta test in Edmonton, Canada in the middle of February. And I got a coat, and I had to walk like this in the coat because it was so big for like the 4 blocks from the hotel to the office. For 3 weeks, I was like, maybe I won't do this. And a friend suggested that I try writing a novel.
Wow.
And the work on the computer game, the sort of structure of it, kind of unlocked the ability to write at greater length, to write a more structured, larger narrative for me. I don't know why, because it wasn't completely obvious to me. Like, it wasn't something that I did deliberately, but somehow it clicked, and that's when I started writing novels.
And in your case, Rebecca, when did your passion and then the job start?
So I can't remember a time when I wasn't reading and writing. So it was something that I loved from a very early age, and I have like memories of getting like printer paper and folding it and stapling it like to make my own books, and like I would illustrate them, and I couldn't even like spell words yet, so I'd draw my R's backward, but I knew what letters looked like, and I would just fill the page with letters and illustrations. So if you had asked me when I was 8, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, I wanted to be an author. Like, it was that early within my heart to want to do it. So I spent like all of my teen years like writing stories by hand at my desk. And so when it came time to go to college, like I wanted to study English because I loved reading and writing so much. I really couldn't think of anything else that I really wanted to study. And it wasn't until I had graduated and I was working just like a normal office job, like the 8 to 5. And I was doing that for a few years. And I had one morning when I woke up and I was like, you know what? I'm not writing at all. Like the past few years, I haven't written a single word. I wasn't even really reading either. Like I was just so focused on just doing the same routine. And I was like, you know, I'm going to wake up when I'm 80 and I'll be looking back on my life and realize that I never wrote a book because I didn't take it seriously, and I'm going to regret that. It's like, okay, what do I need to do to like change things and actually like make time to see if I can write a novel? Right. So I started setting aside time in the evenings. Like the weekends were really like the special like time. Like all day Saturday, I would try to just sit and like work on my book. And we also had some bad like icy weather, and where I'm from we don't normally get a lot of ice and snow, so like they shut everything down because like people don't know how to drive and like 1 inch of ice. So like I had this week where I was at home because inclement weather, and I just spent that entire time just like working on my book. And so I was able to get my manuscript complete like pretty quickly. It was one of those like I couldn't sleep at night because like I would just be thinking about the book, like what am I gonna write next, like what's gonna happen. So I was discovering the story as I was going. So when I finished it, I was like, I think this has a spark. Like, I think this is worthy of publication, but I'm not sure. But I have 2 younger sisters, and they're a lot younger than me, so they were teens at the time. So like, I printed it off and said, well, y'all read this and tell me if it's any good. And so they read it and loved it. And of course, they're my sisters, too, right. So they're, of course, going to tell me, oh, yeah, we loved it. But I think, like, their love of that story, like, pushed me to, like, okay, like, what do I need to do now to get published?
So I always wondering, like fantasy is of course a genre that you both always like experience and you work with. So where did that desire to write fantasy came?
So my answer to this question is that fantasy is all fiction is fantasy, right?
Yeah, you're right.
So it's just I refuse to be constrained by the real world. Yes. Because it's all made up anyway, right? The things we describe in fiction never really happened. So, and for me though, the pleasure of sort of changing the rules, it's twofold. One is just a sort of desire of exploration, right? It's the same desire that makes it so exciting to come to a new city and see new places and have a new experience. That's the same experience that you can have in a fantasy novel, right? Only you can visit worlds that have never been, worlds that once were and no longer exist, worlds that never will be, worlds that might be. That's what you can do, and to me, that is an enormous pleasure.
I think like I read so much as a child, but I really loved the fantasy books the most. So I could tell that I was most drawn to these like imagined worlds that felt very real. So I read the Chronicles of Narnia, and then I really loved Lord of the Rings as a teenager. But it's interesting that there are not very many women in Lord of the Rings. It's basically all men. And I think I remember being like longing to see like myself like in a story like, you know, the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers, like that very epic. It's like I want to see myself. So I was like, you know, I just have to write them myself. You know, just write the story that I want to read. But I do think it was just I've always been drawn to like those fantasy stories, and so naturally it's like what I want to write.
So I've always loved fantasy.
Right.
It's just so fun. It's exciting to think about something that's, you know, outside the boring real world, right?
Exactly.
When I was young, I really loved portal fantasy. You know, books like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You know, there were books by L.J. Smith that had, you know, vampires. Everybody knows the Vampire Diaries. But she also had a couple series where, you know, these teenagers like slipped into this alternate universe. And I always loved those kinds of stories where people from our world, could go into another world. And when I got the chance to write A Curse So Dark and Lonely, I knew that I wanted to do a spin on Beauty and the Beast, and where it was about a girl from our world going into a fantasy kingdom. And I love those kinds of stories where it's just somebody just like me going and doing something fantastical.
Thank you guys so much for your time, and really hope you enjoy your stay here in Argentina.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.